everybody? Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 129 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, I'm exceedingly well caffeinated because we're going to talk about maximizing athletic qualities. How can you absorb force? How can you produce force? How can you twist? How can you rotate? How can you do all types of great things on the athletic field? Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from a couple people, actually. I comboed questions. Well, we got a question from Javi and Iñaka. I hope I pronounced your name right. But here's what they asked. From the point of view of sports training, which infrasternal angle would be more efficient at generating force versus absorbing force? That's an outstanding question. So let's see what's crack-a-lackin' with that. Force absorption is any type of eccentric action. So if I'm, dropping down to go land after a jump, I have to induce eccentric forces throughout my body. Flip-flop that if I'm doing force production. Force production is more concentric bias because the muscles have to concentrically contract to move me in a desired direction. This also happens at the ventral cavity. So at the ventral cavity, what's going to happen is I need to do things within the cavity to eccentrically absorb force, and I need to do things to concentrically absorb force. So how do we stratify that between narrow versus wide infrasternal angles? Well, I'm glad you asked. The way that you do that is by ensuring that as you eccentrically absorb force, the pelvis is going to have to counter-nutate. That's going to be biased towards a narrow infrasternal angle presentation. Flip-flop that with a wide. A wide has more of a concentric bias throughout their ventral cavity. So they're going to be more nutated in nature. So therefore, they're going to be better at force production. That's assuming that there are no other secondary compensations at play, which is a poor assumption to make because most people more often than not are concentrically biased or have secondary compensations. So basically, you got to think of it this way. If I can't counter-nutate the sacrum, if I can't get an inhaled position at the ventral cavity proper, so I can't get any posterior expansion, I really can't expand anywhere, you're not going to be good at absorbing force. On the flip side, if you can't create concentric tension in specific areas, you're not going to be good at producing force. So if a narrow, for example, has restrictions in flexion, abduction, external rotation, you see the knees knock when they go ahead and drop down into a squat or a jump, chances are they stink at absorbing force as well. The fix then would be to teach them ways to absorb or produce force depending on what the restriction is. So for example, and I think jumping is a very easy way to think of this. If I'm going to get someone to jump, I have to teach them to be able to counter-nutate the sacrum as they dip down and then re-nutate as they pop up. So you might regress a jump by working on squatting, working on stacking, of course, it probably goes without saying, things of that nature in order to teach them to absorb force. And then you might work on having them jump as high as possible to produce force. One of my favorite regressions, if I want to take that from just teaching the basic components to actually doing something that's fast, would be a seated box jump. You can do a seated box jump to a box. I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on ZACLED.com/athletic. That's what it's going to be. So you could do things of that nature in order to help you with force absorption. Basically, with that particular activity, I'm minimizing the amount of eccentric stress that I have so I can control a smaller range of motion. And then you would just increase the eccentric stress that someone would have to undergo while they're doing that activity. So to summarize your great question, the combo question from Javi and Nyaka, hopefully I pronounced your name well. General rule of thumb, it's not always the case. A narrow ISA ought to be better at absorbing force, but not so great at producing. A wide ISA is going to be better at producing force, not great at absorbing, but that assumes that there's no secondary compensations. Usually that's a poor assumption. So what you want to consider instead is chances are they're going to have people who stink at both. You want to teach most people how to absorb force, teach them how to get an eccentric bias through the ventral cavity. So stacking, driving sacral counternutation, getting your squat on fleek, all those types of things. And then once they have that, teach them to produce force. And if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question. I had a question, if you have time. How does someone who is interested in PT like this stay relevant throughout PT school? I actually did a whole post on this. I think the guide to getting through PT school, it'll be linked in the show notes, which again, ZACcouples.com/athletic. You want to make sure, and this is like my biggest regret in regards to school itself, but maybe not. Maybe it's just I didn't have context, but I would make sure that you have all of the basic sciences and your fundamentals down pat. Because if you have a really good understanding of kinesiology, physiology, all of this stuff, it's going to allow you to be a better consumer of the more advanced topics like things that we're talking about. So make sure you're devoting an ample amount of time to getting good at that. That being said, if you do have that in place, then I would just, devote a little bit of time throughout your week to consume a little bit of this, because now you can take some of those basic sciences and see how relevant it is in terms of application, because a lot of the times we talk on the debrief in terms of applying this material. That's the one issue with school, is you get a ton of didactic stuff, but you don't necessarily get to apply that stuff. I want you to be able to apply these things, so make sure that you have some type of application process. But please master the fundamentals, try to get really good at understanding that, and then consume this as much as you can. And maybe you're even doing stuff to apply some of this on your classmates. The next question. This time it comes from John and Rich, and here's what they ask. When working with an athlete in a transverse plane move, they feel slower on one side of the hip, on the left in particular, compared to the right. Or if someone feels stuck in a hip during sprinting or agility work, what do I prioritize and what drills do I like? Awesome question. If you have someone who can't come out of the cut or come out of sprinting or basically produce force in an eccentric position fast, you probably got two issues going on there. One, you could have someone, let's bring my son in for this one, we're gonna get nuts, folks. You could have someone who can't dip low enough into position to then explode out of it. So you essentially minimize the stretch shortening cycle, and that's why they feel slow. Because that's really like, when we're talking about athleticism, the name of the game, in my humble opinion, is maximizing the stretch shortening cycle. You have the eccentric portion, you have the amortization portion, and then you have the concentric portion. So amortization, that's when you have that stopping point to where you have that transition to producing force. If I have someone who can't get the eccentric component of that, they can't dip down out of a cut, they can't land effectively when they're sprinting, they might be missing components of the eccentric aspect of the stretch shortening cycle. So for those people, if you don't see them dipping low when they're cutting or changing direction, you probably have to work on things to do that. Some of the basic stacking stuff that I've talked about ad nauseum on previous debriefs, that's the first place to start. But if you want to get a little fancy, you can start doing some shifting-based activities. So perhaps what you're doing is some type of single leg squat where you're shifting one hip back so they can work on loading that. I also think there's a great post or a video that Daddy O'Pops Bill Hartman has on using lunges or split squats for force absorption and force production. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Definitely check him out. Where you basically talk about getting into the hip that you feel slow out of. So you start there, and then you would work on activities that work on pushing you out of that position effectively. You might use a single leg squat to help with loading. That's one of my go-tos because that really works on shifting. You could also use, in terms of a force production issue, a high box step up because it changes the angles in a manner that allow you to produce force out of that position. So those would be examples. You need to work on things where you're shifting into a hip to absorb the force, and then you need to work on shifting out of the hip to produce force. So what that would look like if we just focused on the left hip in particular. You should see the sacrum rotate to the left when you're absorbing, and then when you're producing, you're going to see it rotate away. And it's not just the sacrum, but it's really the entire spine. So anything that rotates ipsilateral to the leg that's working, that's going to help you with absorbing force so you can elicit the eccentric component of the stretch shortening cycle. And then as you rotate away, that's going to elicit the concentric force out of the stretch shortening cycle. I would start with these folks with stacking, working on shifting into position, and there's a couple drills that I like that teach that. Work on shifting out of position. I'll show you some drills that I like that as well in the show notes. And then you would just simply manipulate your activities to do that, with the hope being that eventually you get some transferability to some of the agility or sprint work. But you also have to emphasize those components with your agility and with your sprint work. So that could be where external cueing, that could be where using bands and things like that to pull people into cuts or to perturb them so they push harder out of cuts. All of that's really good stuff. If you want someone who is absolutely black belt at applying those concepts to speed and agility work, you definitely got to check out Lee Taft. I think I have a course note where I talked about some of his stuff. And then from a sprinting aspect, Derek Hansen's probably my go-to guy for that. I did a course review for him where he talked about coaching sprinting in a manner to allow for some of that transfer side to side. Definitely check out that course note as well as Derek. And I also have a couple posts where I talk about agility and speed work. I'll link those as well. But basically, to summarize this wonderful question, you need to stack first, work on shifting into the hip if you find that they lack the eccentric positioning they need to change direction or to sprint forward. And then you want to work on them producing force by shifting out of the hip that they feel slower in. And if you progress in that manner, you're essentially just taking the stretch shortening cycle, breaking it down into segments, and drilling activities that will get you the segment that your person needs. Awesome question. Mohammed, my guy, I hope you're doing well. He asked a question, is stacking promoting posterior pelvic tilt? Yes, relatively. If I'm anteriorly oriented, basically what I want to do is I want to posteriorly tilt enough so the pelvic floor and the thoracic diaphragm are relatively atop one another. That's a good position to at least give you the potential to be able to shift, move in all the directions that you want to move into so no one will mess with you. So yes, great question in that regard. The last question comes from Shane. Here's what Shane asks. You may have spoken about this previously, but I would love to hear how you handle trunk rotation for people who are in rotational sports, golfers, tennis. Another amazing question, Shane. I appreciate you asking it. I'm just getting into working with a lot more rotational athletes. Where I work physically, aside from the internet, Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare. Check them out. We have a lot of pro golfers who train with us and amateur golfers. And my buddy Brian Chandler and Brad Thompson, I'll link them both in the show notes. You definitely want to follow them because they're smart cookies. We've been applying a lot of the concepts with our golfers on a rehab on the rehab side of things and the training side of things. And it's been actually really cool to see because those guys weren't exposed to a lot of the concepts that I talk about, just at least the surface level, but having some mentored application of this stuff has led to some profound effects with some of our rotational athletes. Like some of our golfers have seen changes in club speed, feel, less aches and pains. It's really cool. It's been really cool to see. So the question then is, well, Zach, what are you doing differently for these types of athletes? The answer is a whole lot of nothing. It's the same poop. It's funny, as I've been evaluating a lot of these golfers, and I'm blown away that they can do what they do, because a lot of them have severe restrictions in hip rotation. They don't rotate through the trunk. They don't have much motion in their shoulders, yet they're driving the ball like crazy. They're hitting these amazing putts under pressure. Like it's phenomenal how well they can do what they do despite having movement restrictions. And it kind of makes me question, like, man, what is our relevancy? But the cool thing though is I see that, but then I also see the cool changes that we've gotten, like in terms of club speed, how they're feeling, with very simple stuff. Most of the last few months that I've been working there, the golfers have predominantly been working on stacking. And think of it this way. I don't know if this is accurate, but it makes sense to me. In most joints in the human body, the closed pack position is more extension. When I'm in extension, I'm going to lose the ability to move in multiple directions, or when I hit more of the closed pack position. So if I can do activities that get me out of that position, that promote more flexion, that promote more expansion through the ventral cavity, that's going to free up your ability to twist and rotate by default, because it opens up more motion. And because these athletes are so good at rotating already in a compensatory scenario, that when you give them just a little bit of movement freedom, it can be a complete game changer. Nothing really changes in the initial phases of working with rotational athletes. You have to teach them the stack component, especially because if you now go into some of the stuff that I talk about before and now, if you're going to be teaching shifting and rotating through the trunk and they don't have that stack capability, guess what's going to happen? They're going to arch their back. They're going to stick their butt out like the Jennifer Lopez or Kim Kardashian, whoever you prefer. They're going to flatten their upper back, and that's going to minimize their ability to rotate. So they're going to go back into compensation nation. You don't want to be living there. So get them to stack first. Rule of thumb, obviously I break the rules sometimes, but if you can get some of these folks to squat parallel and it looks pretty good, I think that's a really good point to start introducing some shifting work. Because that's ultimately where you're going to have to go to drive rotation through the trunk and the hips. Because when you are doing shifting, you are inducing rotation through the trunk. So working on your ability to shift, that's a great way to restore thoracic rotation. Check the stuff that I'm going to be sharing on the show notes. If you got someone and you're working on the stack and you still want to introduce some rotation with low risk of not having good movement, doing anything single arm in the upper body is a money way of doing that. Most of the people who I work with, especially in the early phases, aren't doing any bilateral pushing and pulling. I have them doing mostly unilateral stuff where they're alternating, one side at a time if it's pushes or pulls. Same thing with pull downs. All of that usually starts unilaterally and alternating, because when I do something unilaterally, I can induce some degree of rotation. And if I induce a little bit of rotation, that can allow me to restore some of the movement options needed to rotate in these sports. Especially because most people are restricted anteriorly and posteriorly in the thorax. If I can find safe ways to introduce rotation into their lives, that's going to potentially help them quite a bit from a performance aspect. Another great safe way to introduce rotation in the early phases without shifting would be carries. If you hold a weight and then you're swinging your arm as violently and as through large excursions, that's going to promote rotating the trunk with each swing as I raise my arm forward, my trunk's going to rotate to the right. As I swing my arm back, my trunk's going to rotate to the left, if we're talking about the left arm being the swinging arm. Doing anything like that can also be a way to incorporate trunk rotation. And a lot of times, just doing those simple things can lead to profound improvements in their ability to rotate. Because they've rotated at a high level through a compensatory strategy, so they might not be able to do well at the low level stuff that gets them out of that compensatory strategy. So stay the course, start low, start with stacking, work on rotation through a low level by doing single arm stuff or carries, and then once they can squat parallel, then you can think about doing more shifting based work through the lower extremities. And doing those things, working in that sequence, slow cooking the brisket, as I always say, should lead to some profound changes in your rotational athletes. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in to number 129. If you want to learn more, if you're like, Zach, you talked about stacking, you talked about shifting, where do I go to learn more about this? Because I want to move better, I want to feel better, and I want to perform at the highest level I possibly can. Or perhaps your supreme clientele wants to perform as high level as you possibly can. Well, the answer, folks, is ZACLED.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter because, oh my God, I've got so many free things for you. It's disgusting. If you want to look at or simplify your coaching. You know how people move? They do like all these weird things. You ever like coach someone in a split squat and you're like, what's going on there? I didn't know you could even do that. I have this common compensations workbook that will help you stratify how to break up compensatory strategies, and then it gives you simple coaching methods to improve on those restrictions. We can also kick that up a notch by taking you through my free course, Human Matrix Foundations, because you will then get a good biomechanical understanding of why that's happening. There's also about five hours of talks for the newsletters, a free acute to chronic workload calculator. There's just too many things. So sign up there. You'll also get goodies from me every Friday. Holla at your boy. Other things I can do for you on ZACLED.com, I offer a bunch of services. My favorite service, if you want hands-on coaching, you want help applying some of this stuff to your clients, the place to do it is Human Matrix, my seminar. Unfortunately, COVID is absolutely destroying my seminar. But if the COVID gods smile upon us, my next one is October 3rd and 4th in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and November 7th and 8th in Charlotte, North Carolina. Those are the two for 2020. I got a bunch 2021. I'm working on rescheduling some of the ones we unfortunately had to postpone. But definitely just check out the show notes. We got a gang of them. We're going to be all across the U.S., hopefully in Canada if they open the borders in 2021. I hope to see you there. Other services, movement consultation. If you are someone who has a hard time getting in and out of cuts, maybe you can't squat parallel, so you're like, man, I want to shift. I want to get my shift together. What do I do about that? A movement consultation is what you do about that, big fam. What I will do is I will perform a full body assessment on you through the internets. I'll coach you. We will find ways to improve the restrictions that you have so you can do the wild and crazy things that you want to do. I would say we could also offer that from a training perspective, but your boy has completely filled up his slots. However, I am taking people on a wait list, so if you want to wait and see if one of my peeps decides to go out on their own, sign up for the wait list there. Or if you want to learn how to do this with your clients better, you want me to give you some feedback on how you're coaching or how you're applying some of the material, you're like, Zach, I don't even know where to start applying this stuff. The mentorship program can help you with that. We will do remote calls to where we kind of figure out how to best apply this with your people. I do a lot of post-session, making you learn, making sure you grasp material and can apply it effectively. One of my favorite things to do is watch you do your thing with your clients and give you some feedback on what you could be doing better. Sign up for that. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, you've read every single blog I've ever written, ever. And you're like, phew, I want to know where else I can learn from this joker. Well, I got an answer for you. The answer is go to Apple Podcasts and Stitcher, search the Zach Couple Show. Because guess what, folks? There are 128 other debriefs out there. And, we didn't always have 2 camera angles. Definitely didn't have 2 cool pictures. So maybe you just want to listen to your boy. I get it. So go ahead and do that. But while you're there, leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Other places you can find me, I'm all over the social medias. I'm on Facebook and Twitter with the handle being ZCouples. Of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And the last place you can find me is YouTube. If you want to know what type of activities I do with my people to improve some of the restrictions that we've talked about, that's the place to go to check it out. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope you're staying safe and healthy during these wild and crazy times. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.